Are you tired of generic praise and passive listening? This episode explores the critical response process in music education. We'll delve into how it fosters meaningful dialogue, empowers students to give and receive constructive feedback, and ultimately leads to a deeper musical understanding and personal growth.
Welcome to Pass the Baton, Empowering Students in Music Education. Here, we amplify the voices of music teachers around the world who are passing the baton and creating environments where the music students are empowered. Together, we can help students transform from passive consumers to vibrant creatives. Welcome back to the Pass the Baton podcast. I'm Kathryn Finch.
And I'm Theresa Hoover. We're so glad that you're joining us today. So, Kathryn, today was so fun. We've been talking about this topic, critical response process. I've been talking about it with you for a while now, well over a year. And, we've said, maybe we should talk about it on the podcast. So it was really exciting to me when I connected with Mallory, who has such incredible experience in this area. And she was, excited to share what she knows.
Yeah, and she had such actionable steps. I think my brain was like, I have to start at the beginning and I have to do all the steps and it has to be this big, long process. And she kind of helped me realize, no, you would introduce this with your kids in different ways and you don't have to do everything all the time. You can pick a step and really focus on that. And that helped me just take a breath and realize I could just spend some time kind of getting into this process and really understanding it and helping the kids understand it.
Yeah. And for me, the value that I've seen in it, just the little bits that I've tried since I first learned about critical response process is just, it gets people thinking a little bit deeper, both the person who is the maker, the musician, and those who are giving the feedback. It gives us a different way to think about things. And sometimes I know I struggled with that when I was trying to work with my students to say, hey, let's give each other peer feedback. Where do we start? But this really provides a very solid and very clear, here's where you can start and here's how you can get that process going to make it meaningful. So the peer feedback isn't just check the box, but it's actually a thing that we can do and use and find that both, everybody involved can benefit from it.
Yeah. And I think when you said do, and then more importantly, use, I really like how it sets you up to be able to, when you're asking for feedback, it's understood that this is not a finished product. And so I don't have to have that pressure of this. People are going to look at this and I've spent so much time on it. It's my final, no, I may not have gotten to that yet. Thanks for that feedback. I'm not necessarily on that yet. So It is nice to be able to take it and use and then and go on to your next steps with other people's feedback.
Yeah. So before we get to today's interview, we want to remind you that you can support Pass the Baton and get awesome perks.
Join the coffee club for as little as $2 a month and unlock discounts, free resources, planning parties, and more. Check out the link in the show notes to learn more.
All right, welcome back. We are excited to be joined today by Mallory Alekna. Mallory, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is so exciting.
Yeah, I love it. We're getting another little Arizona State connection, and we get to talk about some really great things that I know our listeners are going to love today.
Absolutely. I am so excited to be connecting to two places I've called home across my life, Chicago and Arizona. So this is kind of fun to circle back in that way.
Awesome.
Well, I guess let's start there. Could you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about your background and current role?
Sure. So I'm Mallory Alekna. I currently serve as Assistant Professor of Music, Human Development, and Learning at Augsburg University in downtown Minneapolis. This is my 5th year of being a professor. And prior to that, I was working on my PhD at Arizona State. All of my degrees are in music learning and teaching. And so basically from undergrad until now, I've been doing all things music ed and have done this across Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Indiana, Arizona, and now Minnesota. So while I started as a kid playing double bass in orchestra, I quickly realized I kind of wanted to be able to do all sorts of musical things. When I was young, I thought, I'm going to do everything there is to do music. And so I've dabbled in, going down a trombone pathway or being in choir or musicals. And now in my role at Augsburg, I really get to kind of use that wide array of skills to support anyone who comes in the classroom in developing their own teaching practice. So right now, my work is really focused on supporting people who are becoming educators and specifically music educators.
Yeah. And as you were talking about all of the different things, I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of did that too. A little bit of this and a little bit of that. But I feel like for me, at least, all of those things have come together to make me the educator that I am. And I love that.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think I've had a job in just about everything K-12, and at some point I was like, oh, this is really fun, and also I'm spreading myself really thin. So I feel like coming into teacher education has really like helped bring all of those things into focus in a way that I can kind of rely on in a more sustainable way now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, the focus of our conversation today is critical response process. And I was lucky at ASU, I was able to take a class in this, and I believe you did too, and then took it even farther. So, I guess the first step is, can you tell us what is the critical response process?
Okay, so critical response process is a formal 4-step process, but also a dynamic set of principles that are used to guide feedback exchanges. So giving and receiving feedback. This was developed by Liz Lerman back in the early 1990s. She is a super creative choreographer and visionary thinker, and she has continued to explore this process because she's so curious about it. I got involved with this back in 2016 when I had the opportunity to take a class in it and learn from her. And I continued using this throughout my doctoral studies. I did a lot of my dissertation work through critical response process, but then also use it in my work as a teacher, as a colleague, as a family member. And then in 2022, I also had the great opportunity to do a year-long mentoring and certification program in critical response process, where I was directly mentored by Liz Lerman and her co-author, John Borstel. So yes, I am super nerdy about this thing, but as Liz Lerman says, like, she only wants to spend her brain power on things that she's curious about. And this process is still curious to her 30 years later. And it's still something I'm really curious about just 8 or so years in.
That's awesome. Yeah, I took the same class. Now, sadly, Liz was on sabbatical that semester, so it was some of the grad students, but it was still wonderful. And in fact, I actually made Kathryn participate in we had to do like a mock CRP experience, and I made Kathryn participate in that. So
That's
so
awesome.
We're both into it. Okay, so it's all about feedback, right?
Yeah,
So what does it mean?
So it's all about feedback. It's a 4-step process if you want to start to kind of just dip your toes in. You start by someone has something in progress. A creator, a maker, an artist has something in progress, and they want feedback on it. That's kind of the place to begin. And then you start following the 4 steps. So we've got statements of meaning, which is where if you're the person giving feedback, you're kind of answering the question, what do you notice, find interesting, surprising, worthwhile, what resonated with you? And often in that step, you're working to withhold kind of your initial discomforts or judgments. Those are super important pieces of information, and they come back in a later step. Once you've gotten to exchange that, you go into step 2, where the person who has made the thing gets to ask questions. So what is it that they're most curious about? What is it that they're needing help on? What's front of mind for the artist? Step 3 is then when the responders, the people giving the feedback, start to ask what are considered neutral questions. So instead of just jumping into sharing that opinion, you're often trying to figure out, what is my opinion about, and can I get some more information about that? Which then leads into step 4, which is permissioned opinions. And the responders will say, I have an opinion about blank. Do you want to hear it? And I love this step because it really embeds consent into the process. And the artist, the maker, they get to say yes or no. Are they ready to hear that feedback? So those are the 4 steps, and those are kind of the formal parameters. But then each one of those steps also has these principles and values that you can kind of dissect and play with and bring up in different contexts, whether you're looking at all 4 steps or just playing with 1 or 2 pieces in different aspects of your teaching practice.
Cool. I think I'm going back and forth between 2 things. Like, do we need to now know more what that looks like in the music room, or do we need to before we talk about that, like why this process in the music room? I mean, maybe we start there. Like, why do you think the critical response process is important in a music classroom?
Absolutely. So I was so excited when you asked about doing this podcast. I got to check out everything that your book and your podcast is talking about, because there's a lot of alignment. As a early career teacher, I was looking for ways to do the kind of new, equitable, collective liberation, anti-oppression teaching that people were talking about in my studies. But I was like, how do I actually go into my general music classroom, my digital beat making space, my orchestra rehearsal, my songwriting space? How do I go into these spaces and start doing, how do I embody the kind of liberated spaces that I'm talking about and dreaming about? And when I learned about critical response process, I was like, oh, this is demystifying what power sharing looks like. This is demystifying what striving for more equitable spaces looks like. This is how I actually model and scaffold agency and ownership for students when they have so many other places in their lives where they aren't taught about agency, where they aren't shown that they have a wealth of knowledge in their bodies. So this process for me demystifies all of that and then helps me enact that in my classroom.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And to hear you say it that way it just makes it seem that much more meaningful, because it's not just a matter of like, oh, we go through these 4 steps and move on. No, we're actually giving students the agency. They are able to find that agency in themselves, both as a creator and as a peer, right? To be able to take part in that process. I think that's so valuable.
Mm-hmm. And so like, I think maybe as fellow music educators, we can relate to some of those ideas. Like, I always heard the idea that it's easier for students to engage in something creative when they have some parameters to follow, right? So sometimes we see people go into a classroom and say, this is going to be the most radical, liberated space ever. And I'm just going to say, go for it. And whatever those students want to do, we're going to do. And I love that. I want to come see it. Let's do it. And also, our students are often being brought up and raised in a society that is not playing by those same rules. And so to just say do whatever doesn't always result in the radical liberated change we want to make. So what I love is that we actually are being more radical by agreeing to a shared set of values that we're all going to practice and follow. And that's something I found to be more radical, is to say, we're going to ask this question: how do we want to be together? And we're all going to have buy-in, and we're all going to help shape the learning environment by these values that we're adhering to collectively.
Yeah.
I think about so many times when I've worked with students and you'll say, okay, so what's some feedback that you have? And they just kind of stare at you and they'll say like, it was good. It was bad. It was, I don't know. And this takes that away.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And a lot of times they just haven't been given the tools to think about what is appropriate to notice. And so each one of these steps, I've taken just one step, any one of the 4, and really explored that with students. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, my thinking is expanded and I actually have things to say. So for instance, like in like step 3, which is the responders asking questions and trying to get to neutral, it is really kind of put students in a position to say, what is your opinion about? Is your opinion about the tone? Is your opinion about the rhythm? Is your opinion about you just wish everybody was wearing cool matching tie-dye outfits. Like, what is your opinion actually about? Which then not only informs the feedback that you're giving, but also helps students think about what they want to do with their own work and their own musical, whatever it is that they're working on. So, yeah, I'll leave it there for a second.
So can you maybe walk us through what might this look like in a music classroom?
Sure. So the ridiculous answer would be like, it could look 1,000 million different ways.
Of course.
But some of the ways that I think to start imagining what this could look like is you could start by, like most things we do in teaching, scaffolding. So we could think of an I do, we do, you do kind of approach. So I think any of those same teaching principles that are useful to students could inform the way you roll out CRP with students. So sitting, if you have something that's in progress, it could be something that a group is working on together. It could be that you have a small group project that's willing to be shared. You could even one of the best ways to introduce this, anybody who's super into CRP knows, is to just practice this with something silly and then start to apply it. So maybe there's a piece of music that you want to listen to as a class, and you could even do critical response process along this. And you could have someone even pretend that they are the person who created this music and do CRP around that. But if I think about like a general music space, a lot of times we're sitting and we're listening to music and trying to get young ears really hooked into what's going on. So we can use step 1 to just say, what did you notice, find interesting, surprising, or worthwhile? What resonated with you? And just see how many different things that students came up with, and maybe keep a tally or a list of those things somewhere where students can see, so that they can start to notice like, oh, some of these things were about the instrumentation that I heard. Some of these things were about, the group that I saw performing or the questions that I have. And just that starts to kind of explode like our thinking into a lot of different directions. That would be one way to kind of use these steps to explore things that maybe we're already doing in general music classrooms, like listening activities or creating our own projects and songs. In ensemble type settings, this could also, or really any setting where students are growing something, whether it's learning music together, writing our own songs, creating our own playlist, and we want to get some feedback about the playlists we're creating. You can start to help students learn how to do this as a whole group, but then in small groups, and then in what's called mutual coaching. So this is a one-on-one. So I could take a turn sharing my work in progress, and my partner can go through the steps with me, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we can switch roles. My partner can share what they're working on, and we can go through the steps. I think as I'm saying that, though, it's like important to remember that feedback is the best kind of feedback. I won't quote Liz perfectly, but it's feedback that will be heard and considered. So when we're doing this with students, we really want to create an atmosphere where this is comfortable, safe, inviting. So maybe going through all 4 steps isn't what feels most comfortable for your students. So maybe they're going to start just doing step 1s with each other all the way through. We actually were just doing this in my string methods class with just posture, right? Turn to your neighbor. What do you notice, find interesting, surprising, worthwhile about their posture? Girl, you are standing so tall and proud while you hold that violin. That thumb is curved. Those fingers are round, right? So in another scenario, we might call this like pointing out the good or really like positive behavior reinforcement. But instead of me, the teacher, walking around and saying, do this, do that, we're really empowering the students to learn from each other and with each other.
Yeah. And that little example, that could happen just as easily in a 4th grade class, as a 9th grade class, as a college, like any of those. Turning to a partner, what do you notice? Like that doesn't have to be anything. Anybody could do it. Kathryn, I can't speak to like 1st grade, but maybe they could too. Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
I think that's important. The other thing that really stuck out to me that you said several times, and I'm just like reminding myself, work in progress. The idea is that this is for a work in progress and not, we're not doing this after our concert piece, right? Did I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think there's different ways to conceptualize of work in
Okay.
progress. So I think I would hate for somebody to say, "Oh, our concert's over and now we can't use critical response process." But if we're conceptualizing that we're going to keep learning across the year, and what we just did, like our musicianship is a work in progress,
Oh,
we
yeah.
could still talk about what happened at the concert, right? So I think it depends on the way you're conceptualizing of work in progress. Is the work in progress your musicianship? Is the work in progress that you want the next concert to be better? If you want feedback, I have a hunch that there's something that's a work in progress. For me, I have a big part in my notebook that I see all the time that says, I am the project. And this is part of the reason critical response process has been so exciting to me, is that I am a work in progress forever. And so critical response process is something that helps me think about my life and continue to grow. So yes, work in progress, but also my definition of work in progress has really changed after learning more about CRP.
Okay. Well, that now I have a whole lot to think about. Yeah, I had never thought about it that way because I was thinking I was thinking of the work as like the piece of music we're preparing or the thing I'm composing but yeah, if we think about our musicianship and our growth in that respect as a work in progress, it's anything could work.
Mhm.
And I think that also helps make things more approachable, right? Like
Yeah.
if this thing that I'm working on feels so final and heavy, it is it becomes a different process when somebody's going to see that thing and it feels so finite. But to say that everything is growing and in a work in progress, I think takes some of the fear out of dialoguing about this and starts creating a place where this, in so many artistic environments, what we're talking about in CRP is not the norm, right? I know it's right, and I'm going to tell you if it's wrong, and you have no say. You're just going to have to sit here and hear it, right? But we're finding a way where people can actually receive this information, consider how they want to apply it, and put it back into their work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, it's making me think about what my fourth graders are doing right now. We're in GarageBand. We talked about theme and variation and that form, and we've learned hot cross buns, and we put hot cross buns to a track, and that was our theme. And now we've started to make a second section that is going to be our variation, and we've worked on how to vary that hot cross buns and make it, a different kind of style or whatever we want to do. So I'm hearing you say, like, tomorrow I'm not going to critical response process like partners with each other. That would be too fast. But could you maybe help me walk through, like, so what probably would go first is that I would maybe offer them my example. We're not finished yet. So, like, have them walk through that critical response process with me. That would be kind of a good first step of, like, we're going to do this together kind of thing. So they start to understand the process.
I think you can go a couple different ways. I think, yes, go through the process on something and show them how excited you are to receive feedback from them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just think about how powerful a statement that is to say, these young people are helping me grow my work. You are helping me. You're giving me feedback. That's a really empowering experience for young people to say, my teacher wants to know what I have to say. I think that applies, like we were saying, not only in fourth grade classrooms, but all the way through our adulthood. The other thing you could do that might be interesting would be to pick one of the steps and to look at the value of that step and kind of think about what would be an area of thinking and growth for your students. So I'm thinking about step 2, where the artist asks questions. And you could serve as the artist and you could say, in this second variation, I'm trying to think about all the different ways I could include X, or I'm trying to think of all the different ways I could do this other thing, and see if your students can come up with a list of as many different things, because then they're actually practicing thinking about what they could include into their own work, right? And getting really curious about all the different possibilities. I also think there's a really great opportunity for you to do some modeling of one of the other facets of step 2, which is really the opportunity for the artist to form useful questions that are usually around their worries. So a lot of times when we're doing feedback, we're like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous about this thing, or I'm really unhappy with this, or da, 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 and we kind of just get stuck in that worry. And so we really, in step 2, are practicing turning our worries into questions, because that becomes a really actionable problem-solving way of thinking, especially when we're engaging in a project. But then that problem-solving can translate to so many other areas of our lives. So I think you as a educator could really demonstrate and say, oh gosh, I'm so worried about whatever's happening in this section of music. And then you could say, wait a second, I need to flip that worry into a question. And you might even draw a little table on the board and write your worry over here, and then show the students how you flipped it into a question. And then maybe ask them some things that they're worried about in their own work, or maybe you could give them some examples of worries and ask the students to help you flip them into questions. And so just that act can really, really start to open up them working together, them working with you. And then now they've seen how you do it and they can go apply it to their own work. And all of these things could be totally, like, I'm imagining if they're working on these projects too, you could totally ask them to go come up with a worry about their project and demonstrate to the class how they flipped it into a question. For me, the musical growth is just as important as the dialogue and the community and the thinking that we're doing as humans in these spaces. So those are just a few ideas of what I would do.
Yeah, no, I love that so much, because I feel like just by having that dialogue, we're all learning so many different things about each other. And, you know, I might have a balance problem, but somebody else might have an instrumentation problem. And like, oh, I didn't even think to pick a different instrument. And now I'm like, you know, I'm into your thing because you're telling me about. So I think just the talking about our creations are going to be so helpful for us as composers. That's awesome.
Cool. Yeah, I want to know how it goes. Fill me in.
Oh.
I think that's,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Theresa.
no, I was just going to say that act of being able to articulate what you're doing and why you're doing, or ask the questions about the thing, that's so valuable to the students. And I apologize if I'm jumping ahead. The other thing that I always like, I love about this process is the permissioned opinions. How do you, and I'm asking partially because having participated, how do you convince people that they can say, no, I don't want to hear your opinion? How do you broach that, especially when we're talking about, you know, a teacher-student relationship where we have that power dynamic just naturally?
Well, I think part of it is I work really hard to always be honest and open with my students all the time, so that they know when I say this is what we're going to do and I mean it, that they believe me, right? And so this is actually kind of a little nugget to the side, but I have found, especially with working with the pre-service teachers here at the college level, helping them work on eliminating things like sarcasm from their teaching practice has really helped bolster some more honesty in their classrooms. So that when we say, hey, no, we really respect each other, they know that I'm not going to be, you know, engaging in any sort of teasing or sarcasm. So that's kind of a tangential, but I think really helps this process. The other piece is we have to learn and scaffold consent. We are taught so often in our society. I think luckily there's a lot more conversation going about this now, but 10, 15, 20 years ago, this was not something I heard a lot about in my own education. So to be taught that consent is important and that there are ways to engage in consent is like, it seems so small, but it becomes this totally radical moment in your classrooms. So we practice it. And the first thing we have to do is we have to practice it in these ways that are disconnected from what we're actually working on. So we will actually sit in a circle, which happens all the time in different kinds of music classrooms, or maybe we're in our ensemble sitting in rows, and we will go person to person and we will turn and look at the next person and just say no. We will just go around the room saying no. And then we'll talk about it. Depending developmentally appropriate, we'll talk about it. What's that like? What did you notice? What did you experience? Oh, I was giggling. I was nervous to look at them. I don't know. I felt so nervous in my body. We were saying no, but we weren't even saying it connected to anything, right? So we'll practice that and we'll talk about it. And then learning this all from Liz through her ways of exploring these steps, she would then have us start adding kind of the level of consent next. So the next thing we would do is we would turn and we would just say, I have an opinion about, and we'd have to pick something random in the room. I have an opinion about the color of the door. Do you want to hear it? No. Next. I have an opinion about the carpet. Do you want to hear it? No. I have an opinion about the posters on the wall. Do you want to hear it? No. We just go around the room calling out something we see and practicing saying no. And then keep in mind that not all of this has to be done on one day. Maybe this is something you're growing with your students over time. But then we can go to one level that gets a little more personal. So this time, we're going to ask students to say, I have an opinion about, and it needs to be something that the student is like wearing or holding or has a backpack nearby. I have an opinion about your jacket. Do you want to hear it? I have an opinion about your glasses. Do you want to hear it? I have an opinion about your necklace. Do you want to hear it? And we just practice saying no. And we all know we're going to say no. And we keep dialoguing about that. So breaking it down, going from completely abstract and decontextualized to getting closer to using it in our own work. And just kind of, again, demystifying that it's actually okay to say no. And it's really important for us to recognize how much society has made saying no uncomfortable and to start normalizing that in our space again.
Yeah. I love that. I found even when I work with student teachers sometimes, and just adding that little, I have a suggestion about, I have an opinion about, would you like to hear it? You see this little bit of like relief in their eyes almost. And I would say like, I have a suggestion about, I don't know how you could close this lesson plan a little differently. Would you like to? And they just kind of look like, oh, like she cares what I think. And you can see that it makes a difference. And we haven't gone through the entire process of, being able to work through them being able to say no, but I feel like they take in the information differently.
Well, and sometimes, that's a great example of how we start to live the values that are embedded in this process. And we're really enlivening the different kind of world that we want just by doing that. And that is a teaching moment, whether that student knows they can say yes or no in that moment. You're doing the thing that we're hoping more people are going to be doing. And so it's not always about formally teaching the thing, right? You're enlivening that. And that's so exciting to me, because those are those real moments where that person, you can see them go, oh, this is different. This lands in my body differently. And I don't know. So that's just exciting for me to hear about that. I have the same kind of situation going on with student teachers here, students in class. And the fact that I really show them that I mean it when it comes to feedback is exciting. The question that sometimes people ask me, especially in a teaching situation, is but what about times when like they have to hear the thing that I'm going to say? Right. And they're like, well, I have to give them this feedback, because you could be using critical response process around a work in progress. It could also be embedded in kind of your classroom management, classroom community ethos. So maybe you really have an opinion about the way the student is, doing what they need to be doing in the classroom or not. And so that's kind of where I start to ask teachers or students, like, is this actually us being in the feedback process? Or maybe we're not in critical response process anymore. We can time out. We're not in CRP. We have this other thing that might be classroom management related, and we handle it that way. And then we go back into the process. Or this is also a great time for teachers to be like, maybe I need to think about whether or not, maybe the student can kind of maybe they need to just dance and move in this space. And it's not what I expected, but maybe it really is just an opinion. And maybe it's not actually something needs to happen. So it's also helped me kind of mitigate what I think, it's helped me think about if I'm just patrolling people's bodies or if I'm actually doing something that's safe in the classroom. I know, especially in elementary K-12, we're thinking about that all the time. So.
Yeah. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way either. Like sometimes they are just my opinions.
Yeah. Well, so with the student teachers or with students in class, a lot of times I do have opinions on their work, but I feel obligated that they need to hear something related to the standards that we're supposed to uphold or the actual procedures that keep students safe in schools. And so the way that I've kind of used critical response process to frame that is I'll say, hey, I have an opinion about this thing. Do you want to talk about it now or another time that's better for you? So again, variation of this, but we're still trying to work in consent so that you're ready to hear this feedback when it lands. And students have then said, I am ready to talk about it right now. Or I've had a student say, it's been a really long day. I know that there's some stuff I need to work on, but can we schedule a call later this week and talk it through? And it's just helped us maintain a positive relationship while then getting them the information that they really need to be a successful educator.
Yeah, because there's only so much we can take at one time. Right.
Absolutely.
And especially when I'm thinking about pre-service teachers, there's a lot coming at them all the time. So to be able to be able to take ownership of the fact, like, okay, I'm going to do this right now, and we're going to have this conversation in a couple of days, and I can make sure I'm prepared for that. That's super helpful.
But same thing with our K-12 students, right? Like they are getting,
That's true.
Sometimes I think about the fact that I used to go to class like them for 50 minutes at a time from here to here to here to here, and used to have 8 different people telling me stuff all day long. And how impactful might it be to just say, hey, I have an opinion about that. Do you want to talk about it now or can we check in tomorrow? And maybe that student will come back the next day and say, yeah, I was having a rough day and I'm doing a lot better now. And thanks for just giving me some time, right? As opposed to for 8 hours a day having to really hit some sort of mark. So I think the ethos and the principle behind it can really foster positive relationships long term, not just did you do what you needed to do today, but I see you as a whole human who we interact with each other across time.
Mm-hmm. That's so important for what we do. So important. So what we're hearing is that CRP is not only good for students as musicians, but just as humans in general.
That does seem to be part of the impact.
I love it. Absolutely love it.
One thing I'm thinking of is we went through the steps quickly because it's a podcast and it's, can't be too long. But I'm wondering, I guess, could you direct us to where should we look up those 4 steps if we're like, oh, this is really something I want to dig into deeper? That's my part one of my question. And then my second part is that, in our Pass the Baton, we have this things to try tomorrow. So once we've kind of looked it up and refreshed those steps, like what would you have somebody, I know you've given us some tips already, but what would be one thing I could maybe just try tomorrow in class?
Totally. So I'll start with your first question about where can you find more? So Liz Lerman has a great website. I will provide some of the links. I know you at Pass the Baton kind of posts on that stuff. So there's links to her website. There's also links to critical response process practitioners who are certified, and they are all across the country. So you probably live in the neighborhood of somebody who is also really nerdy about CRP. And that would also be one of my I guess it's not a try tomorrow, but my first tomorrow is you could totally reach out to someone in your area who could be a support. You might find that they are a local artist, musician, teacher already, and just have another great collaborator and co-conspirator in your neighborhood. Also, whoops, I'm not going to grab it because my headphones are too far away, but I think it was just last year, within the last year and a half, Liz Lerman and John Borstel co-authored their first extensive writing on critical response process. And it is just a wealth of knowledge. It breaks down the steps. It breaks down how the philosophy and the values behind each step in Liz Lerman's own words and thinking. So she's really distilled this down. It's also got writings by 20 or more CRP practitioners talking about how they use it in their own practice. And I have learned so much as a musician and educator about being like, how does this visual artist use it in their world? But it's really given me lots to think about how that then works. So lots of websites and the book, and you probably have a neighbor in your area who is also into this. And then let's see, if I were going to try one thing tomorrow, well, here's one thing you could do as a teacher and one thing you could do with your students. As a teacher, I would get yourself a little dice. My good friend Heather taught me this, and she rolls this die every morning, and it lands on 1, 2, 3, or 4. If she gets a 5 or a 6, she rolls again until she gets 1, 2, 3, or 4. And as an educator, I would just pick one of those steps. Maybe it's just step 1. And I would just practice giving step 1s all day about everything, right? Hey, Jimmy, I see you wearing cool shoes. Hey, you, hey, you, hey, you. Hey, you, I see you sitting up tall. Hey, I see you with your instrument up. I see this, I see this. I would just go crazy with step 1s all day and see how many different ways I can bring just one step into my teaching practice. With students, I think I would probably go with exploring step 2 and helping them do some of those worries into questions work. So what is it that you're working on as a class? Start to identify what about it worries you. And who knows, maybe your class is already like, we're not worried about it, we're excited. Great. Then what are the questions you have about the work? And then use those questions generated by students to start taking the work into its next step. I think taking on all the steps can sometimes be overwhelming. So just pick which step is most curious to you and just start using it in your daily life. Like I said, as a teacher, I'm using this when I talk to students about music, or when I'm just talking to them about their lives, or when I'm talking to my coworkers, when I'm talking to my spouse, when I'm talking to somebody at the grocery store. There's always a way to just be practicing one of the steps.
Awesome. And super actionable, which is exactly what we like.
Well, we need these things to help us embody these ideals that we want, right? So we have all these awesome ideas about how we want to be living more collective liberation landscapes in our lives. What does that actually look like and feel like in our bodies? And so critical response process is just one tool that's really helped me start to actionalize all these values that I'm trying to bring forth.
Yeah. I love it. Love it. Love it. All right. Well, you gave us a couple of links. Was there anything else that you would want to share about CRP or how people can connect with you, learn more, any of that good stuff?
Sure. So I am super nerdy about CRP and other things too. And I am a person who actually wants to talk with teachers and connect with people all over the country. I would love to hear an email from you. I would love to get a phone call. I would love to hear from anybody who's just like, ooh, I want to do this. Can you Zoom in? Can you come visit? Like, this is what makes my work really exciting, is just to hear what other people are doing. So please send me an email or get in contact. It's just alekna@augsburg.edu. And, if I can't get out to wherever you are in the country or world, there's a good chance that I have a really nerdy friend who would love to get nerdy with CRP in your area. So I will actually answer the email. I will actually return your phone call and would love to just talk over Zoom, grab coffee, and think about this more. So I love supporting teachers, and I love, that's kind of just what helps me do my job each day. Is I just want to find ways to help teachers make their jobs sustainable. So if talking with me would do that for you, then let's do it. Let's connect.
Oh, awesome. And we'll make sure that we put all the links and email address and all of that in the show notes so people can just click and get in touch with you. And I hope they do, because I want to hear about it too.
Yeah, I'll fill you in.
Good. As I've been trying to do just little things in my work, now you've kind of inspired me to think about where else I can implement these kind of practices. So that's very good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm just so excited that I was able to talk with both of you today. This is super new for me, and I'm going to go sit down and start journaling about what I noticed and found interesting, surprising, and worthwhile about this podcast, because this was a new endeavor for me, and I'm so grateful that I got to have that experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you have found value in our conversation, please hit that like button, subscribe to our podcast, and leave a review. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us grow our community of passionate music educators.